Ladies and gentlemen, how did the co-founder of Wikipedia, way back in 2001, how did he in the past few years, after being a skeptic, after being an atheist, agnostic, actually a philosophy PhD, how did he recently become a Christian, and why? Was it arguments? Was it the Bible? Was it something else? A combination? We're going to hear about it today from Dr. Larry Sanger, who helped, as I say, co-founded Wikipedia way back in 2001. He is a PhD in philosophy from the Buckeyes of Ohio State University. I go there at least once a year, and of course they're the world champions or the college football champions this year. But Larry's going to join us for the full hour here on I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Here he is, Dr. Larry Sanger. Larry, thanks so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's good to be with you.
It's absolutely great to have you on. I've been reading through your testimony, which we're going to put in the show notes. It's over 30 pages of kind of your history, you know, how you became a Christian after many years of being a skeptic. Let's start at the beginning, though, Larry. I mean, I know you were brought up in a Lutheran home. Was Christianity a big part of your life as a child?
Pretty big. My family went to church every Sunday until about the age of 12. My dad was an elder at the branch, the church that we went to. Let's see. I remember praying a lot. And reading the Bible. I memorized a few verses, I suppose. Can't say that I understood it very well, but I was actually, what do you call it? Confirmed in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod about age 12 or 13.
And then you write in your testimony that maybe as a teenager, 16 or 17, you began to ask clergy some questions. And what kind of attitude did you get back?
Well, I didn't actually talk that much to clergy. In my testimony, I tell the story of one time when I called up a pastor. I don't think it was the pastor that I had, but by that time my family had stopped going to church, right? And I had a number of skeptical questions. Basically, I had become intensely interested in philosophy from the age of about 16 or so. And he, in short, was not able to answer my questions. Not just that, I felt like he was a little hostile and perhaps threatened. Of course, I was a snot-nosed kid, so who really knows what actually happened? But he had an opportunity, I think, to say, well, why don't you come in? We'll sit down, maybe find some answers for you and so forth. But he didn't do that. So, it made it hard for me to take the Christian doctrine seriously. Well, it wasn't just that. That was just sort of the icing on the cake. But my unbelief had been confirmed some time before that.
And why did you go from at least nominally being a Christian as a teen or young teenager? What were some of the doubts you had? Why did you suddenly say, well, I don't believe this anymore?
It isn't really so much a particular doubt. It was the notion that I couldn't really prove it up to the standards that seem to be required by reason. So I took a class as a high school junior in philosophy, a one-semester class, pretty lightweight, but it was very interesting to me. In the following summer, before my senior year, I started going through all sorts of difficult problems on my own, essentially, and one of them was the existence of God. And, in the previous few years, I had stopped praying. I had stopped going to church. And I essentially felt the belief slipping away. And when I put all of the reasons that some give against belief, like the problem of evil is very hard to deal with. And then, of course, just the attacks on the traditional arguments for the existence of God. Like, what explanatory work really does the God hypothesis do when all of the complexity of the universe is being explained in something that's even more complex than the person of God? Things like that. Well, I had no means to tackle such difficult questions. And then people like my parents and a brother-in-law who had been to college and others, they were really not, I guess, equipped to handle such problems, to answer me. And I basically came to the conclusion that there ultimately were no good answers, or at least I didn't know what they were, and I wasn't going to believe anything on any subject. This is a kind of methodological skepticism that I had. I wouldn't believe anything unless I knew precisely the meaning of the thing that I believe, and that the reasons that I have for it are really excellent. So I needed all of my beliefs to be rational.
So you went off to college, went to Ohio State for your PhD in 1992. You taught philosophy was it at Ohio State, or where did you teach philosophy, Larry?
Yeah, Ohio State and a few other area colleges.
And during those years prior to becoming a Christian, you co-founded Wikipedia. And you were teaching philosophy as well. What gave you the idea for Wikipedia? How did that come about?
Well, basically, an acquaintance of mine hired me to start Newpedia, which is the predecessor of Wikipedia. And the system that we came up with for editing articles was very arduous, and so we were well agreed that we needed some new way for the general public to contribute. And so a friend of mine told me about wikis, these websites where anyone can go to any page and edit it, and all of the edits are saved, and people just cooperate. And it turns out, that it's easier for people to undo the work of the vandals than it is for the vandals to vandalize. So we tried it out on writing an encyclopedia, and it turns out that works pretty well to a certain extent.
The beauty of it, I find, is I know a lot of people, depending upon your political persuasion, will say, oh, it's biased this way or that way. But it's got all its sources, right? You can look up the sources from which they're pulling information, which is very helpful as a researcher. You can go see where they're pulling the information from. Yeah,
I think that's true. Unfortunately, on a lot of controversial topics, the sources often don't say what they're made to say. And some people are not above just adding in non-existent sources, things that are hard to check up on, like library books, and so forth. Entire topics can be made up, and if they sound plausible with made up sources, then they can be foisted on people. So it's not perfect, but it is surprisingly robust for the amount of openness there is in the system.
Yeah, well, you just pointed out, though, is something that illustrates the depravity of man. Sometimes people are making up sources so they can put forth an untruth that they want out there. But more with Dr. Larry Sanger, and how he became a Christian is fascinating, so you don't want to go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek. We're back in just 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere. How did the co-founder of Wikipedia, a skeptic, somebody that believed in methodological naturalism, become a Christian? We're going to talk about that with my guest today, Dr. Larry Sanger. Before I get back to Dr. Sanger, let me point out that we're moving CIA, the Cross-Examined Instructor Academy. We had it scheduled in Florida, and there were some logistical problems. It's going to be back in Charlotte this year at the end of July. I think it's July 31st, August 1 and 2. If you want to be a part of the Cross-Examined Instructor Academy, if you want to learn how to better present the evidence for Christianity and also answer questions about it, you want to come to CIA in Charlotte. There's a application process. It's not inexpensive, although your tuition does not completely cover the cost. We fund it. Well, donors fund it at the ministry. And this is going to be, I think, our 18th or maybe 19th year. I think it's 18th year. Anyway, it's not just going to be me teaching you. It's going to be Greg Koukl. It's going to be Richard Howe. It's going to be Alan Parr, Natasha Crane, Elisa Childers, Jorge Gill, several others. Go to crossexamine.org, click on events. You will see it there. You need to sign up soon or apply soon. And if you do, you'll get in on the ground level. You're not only going to hear great presentations, you're going to present back to us, and we're going to evaluate you. Now, if you don't want to present, that's okay. We have a non-presenter track as well, but I encourage you to be a part of the presenter track. Go to crossexamine.org, click on online courses, not online courses, click on events. You'll see it there. All right, let me go back to Dr. Sanger. Larry, I heard an interview you did with our friend Dr. Sean McDowell where you were talking about how you're teaching philosophy at a major university and you have your PhD already. You teach a class where you don't want the students to know your perspective. You ask them up front, and this is all in your testimony, by the way, how many people in here are theists? How many are non-theists? How many are agnostic? And you were kind of agnostic, atheist, I guess, at the time. But something happened to you where you started to be interested in Christianity because up to that point, you didn't think that much about God. What changed?
Well, I thought about God and to the extent that, like, as you say, I taught the topic. But you're right, I didn't read the Bible. I did not really feel strongly motivated to investigate general religions. The reason for that would have been my thoroughgoing commitment to naturalism. I would say. So there's really nothing to investigate. I mean, there couldn't be. So why did that change, I guess, is the question. It's interesting. There's a lot of different parts to it, but I think if I had to put my finger on one that would explain why I shifted away from naturalism, it would be, well, I actually have to pick two. One is that I actually started to believe more strongly in dualism of some sort. That there is no good way to make sense of what philosophers call mental phenomena, of what it feels like to perceive something in the world, for example, unless you make reference to more than just the meat in our heads, essentially, and the processes that are involved there. So that was part of it. I started taking that more seriously. I was not totally convinced, but I now actually think there is such a thing as a soul. And the other thing is, it's a little arcane, I suppose, but I think a lot of people will be able to, they'll be able to relate to this. We have thought a lot in the last several years about the consequences of AI. Everybody has been thinking about this. And I was thinking about this back in, I guess, 2017. And I had read this novel called Ringworld by Larry Niven. And in this science fiction novel, we're asked to imagine that some super advanced intelligence had created a ring all the way around the sun, right? And all parts of this ring were inhabited. And it seemed to me that, what happens if the singularity actually occurs, if it's real? In other words, if AI becomes so advanced that it can exponentially add to its intelligence, and then what happens a million years after that? We are amazed at how much progress there has been in technology in the last 100 years. Imagine that continues on, superpowered by the singularity for 1,000,000 years. Isn't it possible that we can imagine, someone actually making new moons and new planets and new stars and solar systems and galaxies and universes? It's all just iterative. Or at least that's the idea. I don't know if this is possible, but it's conceivable. And one of the reasons that I had to doubt the existence of God is that I had no idea what it would mean for my mind to just cause something to come into existence with a thought. But here, we're talking about Neuralink prosthetics where I can just, with a thought, cause things to happen. Well, what if that sort of technology becomes even more advanced, and then what we are conceiving in that case is a mind that can create whole universes by thinking about it. Again, I'm not saying this is possible for any descendant of human beings, but it was interesting when I thought of this argument that it was conceivable. And I said, well, if I can conceive of that, the only difference between that and God is that that sort of being is self-existent. And that if that's the only difference, then, it seemed to me that I basically had a reasonably robust idea of God, right? So it seemed to me that just technological developments and what technology was making possible made me rethink some of the assumptions that I had made, the naturalistic assumptions.
You also mentioned in your testimony, which again, friends, will put in the show notes, that at one point when you were at Ohio State, you had a young man come in to you and talk to you briefly about the fine-tuning of the universe. And you actually said, I teared up over that. And then he abruptly left the room, I guess to leave you with your own thoughts. But in your testimony, you went on to say, I still think this remains one of the strongest arguments for God. And Richard Dawkins would agree with you. So did Christopher Hitchens before he passed away. And in your testimony, you have this one line I want to read, which I find fascinating, and maybe you can unpack it and comment on it. You go through some of the sense of the fine tuning, and you say this one line. You say, the emergent scaffolding of order in the universe is the miracle. What do you mean by that?
Well, yeah, it does take a little while to unpack. I'm working on a book now in which I do unpack it in a few chapters. And it goes like this, essentially. If we want to explain the universe, we are doing a lot more than explaining the origin of matter and energy. Mm-hmm. We also have to explain the laws and the constants that sort of give order to the matter and energy. From the very first moments of the Big Bang, what physicists tell us, there are already multiple laws in operation. And the thing is, you can actually say that in the evolution, if you want to use that word, of the universe, according to the current physical model, there was a time before which there had never been atoms, and after that there were atoms. A time before which there were no molecules, and after that there were molecules, and so forth, all the way down to stars and so forth. And each of these layers of order, we could call it, or levels of the scaffolding of nature, as I call it, has its own set of laws. And when you look, for example, at the periodic table, now any decent chemistry student can actually explain why the rows and the columns of the periodic table exhibit the amazing structure that they have. And yet, what is ultimately the explanation for why that set of explanations, the phenomena that give rise to that order, why did all of those things come together in the way that they did? So you can say, well, sure, there are the rows and the columns because there are these things called electron shells, but the thing is, unless all of those different facts that you can reduce the order to, unless they were just as they are, then the order wouldn't be in existence. So the idea is that the only sort of explanation that we can give, not of how it emerges or how the order is reducible, but rather the conjunction of the antecedent facts that give rise to the order, the only sort of explanation that we can give for the conjunction of those facts, the laws, the constants, and so forth, is precisely that they would give rise to the order. That is actually the only way that we have of making sense of that. But of course, as I just said, the relatively disordered state precedes the ordered state. So one actually comes before the other. And yet, in some sense, are we actually saying that the ordered state caused like a selection of the laws that give rise to them? It really can't work that way. There's no backwards causation.
There's so much more to talk about it with Stephen Hawking, who said, who breathes fire into these equations? Why are they what they are? We'll talk more with Dr. Larry Sanger, PhD in philosophy and relatively new believer in Christ. Back in 2 minutes. Don't go anywhere. How does a philosopher, a skeptic, somebody who helped create, the co-founder of Wikipedia, go from someone who believed in naturalism, that all there are natural laws, there's no supernatural, you don't have a mind, you just have a brain, you don't have a soul, you just have a body, everything is caused by the laws of physics, you're nothing but a moist robot. How did those beliefs eventually get to the point where Dr. Larry Sanger is now a Christian who believes in the supernatural? And of course, Jesus is God. Jesus is our Savior. How did all that happen? We're talking about it here, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Just before the break, Larry, you were explaining how there's this scaffolding of order out there, and all these laws and constants that make up our universe have to have an ultimate source in a mind. Now, I noticed in your testimony, you rightfully point out that this doesn't necessarily prove the Christian God, because you would need some evidence from history and Jesus to see if it's the Christian God. But how were you led from the idea that there's a designer out there to the idea that that designer is Jesus himself?
Well, it's interesting. There are so many different components to the explanation. Ultimately, it has to do with the fact that I read the Bible. So I can tell that story if you like. How
Yeah, in fact, I want to, if it's okay, I want to read, if I can find it here, this paper that Larry put together, ladies and gentlemen, is fascinating, and I highly encourage you to read it. Again, it's in the show notes. The title of it is How a Skeptical Philosopher Became a Christian by Dr. Larry Sanger. And why don't you start your explanation? I'm going to read something from your
Sure.
when I find it, but go ahead.
So, as I say, there are many different moving parts. It wasn't just one thing. One of the parts was in 2019, just before everybody started learning about Jeffrey Epstein. I actually started learning about Jeffrey Epstein from a friend of mine. And he was telling me about how, on his view, the people who violate children systematically are actually secretly occultists, and that this is actually important to understanding why this stuff takes place at all. And I could not really believe it, but he kept pushing me in to look at the symbology and consider certain books that had been written, the Freemason history and so forth. And at a certain point, I said, well, if there's anything to this, because these people actually do seem to take their beliefs very seriously, and it has a real effect on their behavior. I'm not saying that everything that my friend said was true, but it became clear to me that yes, there are a lot of influential people who have a lot of what I would consider creepy beliefs. And I didn't want to read these books by Helena Blavatsky and Albert Pike and all the rest of these people. If there was any sort of spirit realm, I knew I wanted to be on the side of the angels. I always said that. And I said, well, if I'm really going to understand this stuff, then I need to read the Bible. Because basically the occult is a perversion of the ideas in the Bible. It is a deliberate twisting. And so I just put all of that stuff aside for a few months. And then the following winter, I was just looking for some bedtime reading. And I said, well, why not the Bible? I did want to go through that systematically at some point. So I said, okay. And within a few days, I had been hooked. I mean, I had read the Bible, lots of parts of the Bible before. But one thing that I had never actually tried to do is simply try to understand it in the way that the Christians understand it. In other words, my topic was not to decide what I think about the Bible. It's like, okay, because that was old hat to me. I knew what I thought about the Bible, but I didn't know what the Christians really thought about the Bible. I had not tried to make sense of that. And what was amazing to me is that when I looked up the answers to my many, many skeptical questions, saved up over the years, I was kind of shocked to discover that not only were there answers to all of my questions, they had thought of many more questions I hadn't thought of, in some cases, maybe even better questions. And they also had answers to them. The answers, increasingly, as I went through the Bible and put them together, made a certain kind of coherent sense. Now, I'm not saying that I just read the Bible and I started believing it. And of course, that's not what happened, right? As I said, there are many moving parts. So my reconsideration of the traditional arguments for the existence of God was another one of the parts. And another part, of course, for sure, is my realization that each individual argument for the existence of God, traditional argument, is not best regarded as having the conclusion, therefore God exists. I actually think it's much more helpful, certainly was more helpful for me at the time, to restrict the claims made by the argument to what is directly supported by the premises. So the conclusion of the argument from contingency is, therefore, a necessarily existent being exists outside of the space-time universe and explains the contingent facts in this universe. That is what is supported by the argument from contingency. And it takes further, but the thing is, when you put all of the conclusions of the various arguments for the existence of God together in a certain way, which I explored in, let's just say, very doggedly over many months and actually the following years, I came to see just how strong the case was. But it's hard. This is one thing that a lot of skeptics do not understand. And I think a lot of apologists also don't understand, is that it is hard to express all of the reasons that we have for changing an entire worldview. Because when you come to believe a single simple conclusion like God exists or the Christian God exists, there's so much that's packed into that it's just a mistake to suppose that that's the conclusion of a single argument. It represents an entire worldview. And if you want to shift a worldview, then yes, the process of doing that is going to have many different moving parts.
What I found fascinating, and the exact quote I'm looking for, I don't have in front of me, but what I found fascinating, Larry, is that you read the Bible earlier in life and it didn't make the same sort of impression on you. But when you began to read it more critically, actually,
yeah,
you somehow were fascinated to the point that you wrote a 500-page commentary on the book of Genesis. I mean, how did you go from somebody who was apathetic about this series of documents? The Bible's not a book, it's a library of books.
Yes.
But you then dove in full force, and you write in your testimony here that you used to think these things were just written by Bronze Age shepherds.
Uh-huh.
And now that you dive into the actual Bible itself, what did you find that caused you to be fascinated with it to the point that you then went back and looked at the arguments for God and said, they're making more sense now?
Yeah. It's very hard to explain without actually retelling the history of salvation, frankly. I actually think that when you try to grasp what the Bible is saying as a unified story, and it helped that I actually tried to read it in 90 days because it's easier to see when everything is sort of like before you, at a glance, as it were. I was able to sort of reconstruct the Bible story from the fall to the first covenants to the introduction of law to the Davidic dynasty to the Messiah prophecies to the fulfillment of the Messiah prophecies. All the rest of that. I can just summarize it the way that I just did, but it is not the same as actually reading the text and asking hard questions about it and just realizing the text sustains the 2,000-year-old tradition of critical examination of the ideas behind it. That's really something, right? There are not any gotchas about the Bible that I am scared of at this point. And the thing is that that's actually the thing that really surprised me. And when I say that the Bible is a work of really great beauty and wisdom, that's actually a big part of what I mean, that it withstands critical examination. And more than that, actually, it invites it. And you cannot understand a lot that the Bible has to offer if you don't ask hard questions, some of the very hardest questions. You just won't make sense of why it says certain things unless you ask about them and you seek the answers from other parts in the text often.
We're talking to Dr. 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧, co-founder of Wikipedia, who became a Christian in recent years, and he's explaining how he went from an atheist to an agnostic to somebody who believed in God and now Christianity. A lot more with him in our final segment. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Back in 2. Welcome back to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. You know, Dr. 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧, my guest today, was talking about how he got the big picture story of the Bible by reading it in 90 days. That's a great kind of goal to give to yourself. How do you get across the overall view of the Bible? That's one way of doing it. And through story, by the way. While the Bible's not technically a philosophical book, it's more a story of redemption. And that's one way you can teach your kids biblical values. You know, Brave Books has some great stories that they put in their book that you can get for your kid, you know, age 3 to say 12, maybe. Those books are written for anywhere in that time range. I've got grandkids who are 3 and 4 who love them, and of course older. Go to bravebooks.com to learn more. You know, we had Kirk Cameron on a few weeks ago, who is kind of behind Brave Books. I love the work they're doing to really teach your kids the great Christian values and truths. So check out bravebooks.com. And of course, the bravest book of all time, the book called The Bible. Now, Dr. 𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧, when you started to investigate the Bible, you also looked into what both sides, people who are atheists and, of course, people who are Christians, said about the Bible. And you found a bit of shallowness on both sides, didn't you? Let's start with the atheists. What did you find there?
Well, it actually went back to the advent of the new atheists, you know, around about 2000, 2005. They started putting out books like The God Delusion and so forth. And I thought, well, this is interesting. These are potential allies of mine, I thought. You know, and maybe they do a good job of you know, explaining what is wrong with theism. And I picked up the books, and I was just shocked at just how shallow the arguments were. I mean, I thought or frankly, any graduate student in philosophy could do better than most of what they were writing. Of course, they're popularizations, but the thing is, it wasn't just that they were like very sloppy, popular versions of skeptical arguments. It's that there was this disrespect that I couldn't relate to. Like, I knew my family and friends who were still believers, and you know, I had quite a few. Were not stupid. And I thought that it was entirely possible to be a rational believer. I knew of Alvin Plantinga and William Alston. I had assigned readings from William Lane Craig and so forth. These people are not stupid at all. And their belief, I was ready to concede, was rational. But the atheists seemed to maintain just doggedly that it was just obviously irrational, that theism was obviously irrational. Well, it's just it was insulting to people that I loved, and that actually made me feel a little bit defensive on their behalf, as it were. And yet, I would look at debates that featured apologists, and no offense, I hope, but a lot of these sorts of debates they didn't move the needle at all for me. Now, a large part of the reason for this is that they were pitched at non-philosophers, and I was a philosopher. But I actually think there's more to it than that I have been thinking about lately, especially since my conversion, especially since my conversion story came out. Namely, that we need to meet the skeptics where they are. If you can't demonstrate that you understand their point of view, then they have much less reason to take you seriously. And this is it's very difficult, actually. It's sort of like emotional and intellectually difficult. If you don't have a lot of experience with this, you actually have to do a lot of background reading to even get yourself into the mindset of a skeptic. So I'm not blaming anyone for not doing this, but this is why I'm saying that a lot of the apologetics might not be working, because it's really it's shoring up the faith of people who already have it,
right?
As opposed to constructing a unified case for changing a worldview. You see, there's two different ways that you can use arguments in rhetoric, I say. One is you can use them as bludgeons, where you basically hit your opponent over the head with the argument. So there, refute that. And most people don't take kindly to that, even if they can't respond. They're not convinced, right? And why should they be? Because for the most part, as I said, changing a whole worldview involves changing many different pieces of a puzzle that is a very complex puzzle. And your argument might only address one of the pieces. I actually think the thing that's really persuasive is to share things that people have never really heard before, perspectives. Like, I'll just give you a random example. In response to my testimony, this fellow philosophy PhD who became a pastor, he said, "Well, now I'm a pastor with a prison ministry," and so he's like the lead chaplain at the prison, and he says, "There are stories that I can tell that would be really eye-opening to a lot of people, and surprisingly so, about what happened in the lives of people in prison." Now, I'm not saying that this is going to work for very many skeptics, because, the skeptics are on to you, believe me. They know all your tricks. But what I'm saying is, I mean, if they have the experience, as I did, and a lot of them do, there's nothing that you can say that will persuade them, except if you actually point something out they hadn't thought of before and just doesn't fit in very well with their point of view. And short of that, you have to basically lay it all out and not suppose that you can explain everything in the form of a single argument, because you can't.
That's right. That's one of my frustrations with debates too. When you do a debate, you're really just giving summaries. You don't really have time to develop the arguments. And it's more complicated than a 2-hour debate, especially for the Christian God, because you've got to go from does God exist all the way to Jesus rose from the dead. How do you have time to do that, in one debate? It's very difficult to do. It's a summary. I can't remember who said this, but I think it's true. Somebody said a little philosophy leads one to atheism, but a lot of philosophy leads one to God. Is that your experience?
I can't say that it was. To be perfectly honest, I'm just saying the honest truth. I'd been away from philosophy for 20 years, at least teaching philosophy. It was actually reading the Bible. But the thing is, by reading the Bible, I actually gained these new perspectives. Like I just sort of naturally went back to, it's like in riding a bike again, because I had taught these arguments several times to undergraduates. And I just went back to them and said, no, wait a minute. There's certain things about these arguments I'd not really thought of before. I don't remember this. And there's actually things that the Bible itself says that are very fruitful. We don't have time to go into examples.
Well, I know you said before that Psalm 19 and maybe a couple other Psalms kind of woke you up to, I guess, the fact that there must be a creator and sustainer out there.
Right. Well, Exodus 3, the
I am.
The great I am.
Yeah.
The explanation that theologians give of that passage is that if he says that his identity, that his name is he who is, then if that's the meaning of his name, then he's saying that what he is, first of all, above all else, is an existent thing. But that actually fits perfectly with the argument from contingency.
Yes.
He's the necessary being.
Yes.
And in the context, right, of the overall story, it struck me as being unusually profound.
It is, Larry. It's amazing. And if we had time, we could unpack that further. But I want to let people know first of all, what are you doing now and what's your website?
Right now, I'm the president of the Knowledge Standards Foundation. So we're collecting the Encyclosphere, a collection of all the free encyclopedias in a standard format.
Wow.
And my personal website is 𝗧𝗦𝗓𝗏.org, and you can find my testimony there. And a number of other articles and recent videos about theological topics since I've gone into that. So,
Larry, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Great testimony. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's Dr. Larry Sanger, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, this weekend I'll be in Dayton, Ohio at Zenna Nazarene Church. That's the 13th. On the 14th, I'll be at Wright State University, also doing a couple of high schools on the 14th and 15th. Check our website for more, crossexamine.org. God bless. See you here next time.
If you're looking for solid answers to life's biggest questions, don't miss the latest episode of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, iHeart, OnePlace, and Podchaser. Tune in, discover the truth, and share it with someone who needs it. Let's keep spreading the truth together.